There's a move almost every Christian makes the moment Romans 9 comes up, and they think they're defending God when they do it. They soften the wording. They add nuance nobody asked for. They turn "I have mercy on whom I have mercy" into something that feels safer. Paul spends this entire chapter showing why God doesn't need that kind of help. God picked Isaac, not Ishmael. He picked Jacob, not Esau. He picked them by name before either one had even been born. That's not God picking a nation. That's God picking a person. And that makes people uncomfortable enough that they'd rather rescue God than let him say what he said. I've spent 30 years walking people through this chapter. Every time I've learned the same thing. You can't argue your way around it. You have to actually deal with it. So let's get into it. A lot of good Bible teachers read Romans 9 this way. So let me state it as fairly as I can before I push back. Here's the idea. Paul isn't talking about God picking individuals for heaven or hell before they're born. He's talking about Israel's role in history, the whole nation, chosen for a covenant and a mission, and inside that nation, a faithful remnant who actually trusts God. Jacob and Esau stand for two nations, not two souls. Pharaoh stands for Egypt's role in the story, not his own personal faith. And I get the appeal. It takes the sting out of the chapter. Instead of God, and this is how a lot of people frame the discomfort, not how I would put it, picking you for hell before you existed. It's just Israel's place in the story that ultimately leads to Jesus. That's a real relief for people who have been scared off by this passage. But that reading has to explain its own best evidence. And the verses it leans on say something a lot more personal than just about a nation. Right now, somebody's watching this and they're panicking. Wait, are you saying we don't even have a choice? That God just creates people to send them to hell? That we don't even have to evangelize anymore because it's already decided? No. Nobody who actually studies this seriously teaches that people don't have real choices. The Bible holds two things together at once. God is fully in charge, and you are still responsible for what you choose. So watch for that as we go. And this isn't about Calvinism or picking a theological team. This is about what the text actually says. So if this reading is right, its own best evidence needs to actually be about a nation. So let's look at it more clearly. Paul gives us two examples back to back, and the second closes a loophole that the first one leaves open. In verses 7 through 9, he points to Isaac and Ishmael, both sons of Abraham, but only Isaac carries the promise. Someone could say, well, yeah, they have different mothers, so it could still be a family line thing. Okay, I hear that. But then verses 10 through 12 go one step further. Jacob and Esau aren't just brothers, they're twins. Same mother, same father, same moment of birth. Before either one had done anything good or bad, God said the older will serve the younger. Only one thing decided the outcome. And it wasn't family line or behavior. It was purely God's choice, made about two individual boys before they even existed. Now somebody's thinking, that's just how genealogy worked back then. And that's a fair pushback. But genealogy doesn't explain why the older serves the younger before either one had done a thing. That's not lineage, that's a choice. Now yes, Genesis 25 does say, two nations are in your womb. And that's true, and it matters. But those two nations only exist because two individual men were chosen by God first. You don't get to Israel and Edom without God choosing Jacob over Esau as a person. And that's not just a fair point to concede. It backs up what I'm saying. God has always been choosy to a certain extent about where and when people hear the gospel. Of course, we live in America, and most of us have had a Bible in our hand our whole life. But what if someone else is born where the gospel still hasn't fully arrived? Is that fair? No, but it's reality. And that's exactly why missions matter. It's why we're passionate about going to the ends of the earth instead of shrugging it off. God has always worked this way, and it's more evidence for Paul's point, not less. The nation is real, and it matters. But the choosing here starts with a person, named before he was born, before he had actually done anything at all. So, if it's not about a nation, who exactly is God talking about here? Most people read right past these verses, but let's take a closer look. Paul quotes Exodus 33, where God is describing himself to Moses, not Israel's future. And he says, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. Paul's very next line isn't about Israel at all. He says, it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. No nation in that sentence, just a man and God's mercy. Then Paul brings up Pharaoh, a person, not just Egypt as an idea. And he says, for this very purpose, I raised you up to show my power in you. And then the Bible tells us that Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And it also tells us that God hardened his heart as well. So both are true at once. And that's not a symbol for a country's faith. That's personal. Now you could say, well, Pharaoh's just a stand-in for Egypt. Except for this, a nation doesn't have a heart that it can harden. Only a person does. And here's something that's kind of easy to miss. Israel had no problem with any of this when it worked in their favor. Nobody in Exodus complained God was unfair to Pharaoh. They were thrilled that he judged Egypt and that he showed them mercy. The problem only shows up when that same sovereign choosing gets turned towards them. And that's not incidental. This is Paul's actual explanation for why more Jews aren't coming to Christ in his own day. And he tells us essentially it's inside God's sovereign plan. And you can't get around that. And that's what seals the argument that I'm making. If this were only about a nation's job, Paul had the words for that, and he didn't use them. He used the word whom. This next part decides the whole argument. So stay with me. If the just about the nation reading is ever going to hold up, this is the section where it has to. God mentions vessels of mercy prepared beforehand for glory, even us, whom he also called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. I think it's pretty clear that Paul isn't talking about Israel's history anymore. He's talking about who's being called into mercy right now. And he names Gentiles, not just Jews. And that's a problem for a reading that needs this whole thing to stay inside Israel's story. But Paul just stepped outside of it himself. Now, I know someone could still argue that the church corporately is replacing Israel, and that's still talking about a group. Except look at the word that Paul actually uses. It doesn't say the church, he says us, a specific people called right now. And you can't get more intimate or more personal than that. And he does the same thing again in verse 30 through 33. Gentiles who weren't even trying end up right with God. Israel, who's pursuing the law zealously, doesn't make it. They don't get there. That's a story about who trusts God, not a nation's assignment. The nation part, to a certain extent, is true, and it is important background. But we got to note that Paul doesn't stop there. He pushes it forward on purpose until it lands on you and me. Before we wrap up, here's something that'll help you with a lot more than just Romans 9. Every hard passage is usually answering a real problem. And most confusion happens because people never stop to ask what that problem is. Paul isn't randomly musing about who goes to heaven here. He's grieving over something specific. Why haven't more of his own people come to Christ? That's the problem sitting behind this whole chapter. And once you see it, verse after verse makes a lot more sense. So the next time a passage confuses you or is hard, don't jump to what does this mean? Ask first, what problem is the author actually addressing? If you find that, it usually opens the passage right up for you, and you'll begin to understand it in a new way. So, where does this leave us? The It's About a Nation reading isn't wrong. Israel was really chosen for a role in God's plan, but it's not the whole answer, and Paul won't let it stay that way. The same mercy that picked Jacob before he was born is building God's people right now, Jews and Gentiles, called, not earned. And remember, none of this means you're a puppet. You still make real choices, and you're still responsible for them. God is fully in charge, and you are fully accountable. Both are true at the same time. This was never meant to be a comfortable chapter, I can admit that. But it's also not meant to leave you scared either. Because a chapter later, Paul says this should lead us to humility, not more arguing. Because if you belong to God, it's not because you were smarter or more deserving. It's because He has passionately poured out His grace upon you. So this week, don't ask, was I secretly picked for heaven or hell before I was born? You can't answer that. And it's not what Paul's getting at anyway. Ask the real question. Have you just been close to the things of God, or have you actually trusted Him? That's what Romans 9 wants you to sit with. If this question, where your choices end and God's mercy begins, got you thinking, I made a whole video on this same type of tension on Romans 7, and I'll link it below. And if this helped you see this chapter as one connected story instead of a scary verse to avoid, that's exactly what this channel is for. So subscribe if you want more of that. And as always, stop reading the Bible in pieces and see the big picture.